name is Paula Hemdel, and I'll be the moderator for this free webinar that's sponsored by ECCRT, or the European Center for Clinical Research Training. I'd like to give you a few points about how we are going to manage this webinar. Everybody is muted at this point and will remain muted throughout the whole webinar. If you do have questions, and we encourage you to ask questions, please use the chat room that's in the box on the webinar section. I also want to point out that this webinar will be recorded and available as a free resource on the ECCRT website and a YouTube channel. So please do ask the questions at the end, and then we'll be able to have the trainer respond to those questions. I'd like to introduce the topic and the trainer. The topic is on co-monitoring, and it's being presented by Elina Murtumaki, who has many years of successful experience in clinical operations. She's worked in both big and small pharma, previously working at Merck, Sharp, and Dome, and then a few other smaller companies. Over the last 10 years, she's been an active consultant for the pharmaceutical and medical device development, and she provides leadership spanning both the clinical operations and the clinical science area. She has joined the ECCRT faculty and now provides regular training in clinical research and particularly in co-monitoring. I'd like to also point out that this co-monitoring topic is a very interesting one personally to me. I think it's very beneficial for monitoring in clinical trials. And this presentation will give you an overview of the benefits of co-monitoring, as well as providing you with an overview of the regulations and sponsors' responsibilities. So let's go ahead and continue. And I'd like to introduce Elena.
Thank you, Paula, for opening the webinar, and good afternoon to all of the attendees this afternoon. So really, the purpose of this webinar today is on co-monitoring is just a brief overview of the topic, and more specifically, regulations and the sponsor responsibility, why we think that co-monitoring is vital, even beneficial for conduct of your overall clinical trial, or even for your overall clinical development plan. I'm going to be going through a few principles of the CRA, your clinical monitor oversight, and also one aspect of the co-monitoring is obviously the site performance. Okay, so really let's look at the background and the framework for the regulations and the sponsor responsibility. A lot of the companies have realized, I would say over 5 or 10 years, that co-monitoring your site, CRA, CRO oversight is a fundamentally important function, and the responsibility is really carried by the sponsor. Obviously, you have a team of excellent third vendors and third parties who support your program, but ultimately they have understood that it is really the sponsor responsibility. But as the companies, when we were looking at them, and also based on the personal experience, we noticed that there were some companies who have done to some co-monitoring to a certain extent, but they haven't quite realized that it needs to be really a systematic process as part of your conduct management of your clinical research and even the entire compound development. Okay, but so when you look at the more recent ICH GCB E6 guidelines, it does actually state in the addendum 5.5.2 that the sponsor should ensure oversight of any trial-related duties and functions carried out on its behalf, including trial-related duties and functions that are subcontracted to another party by the sponsor contracted CRO. So there it is, the key word, the fundamental key word, oversight and subcontracted. So it is now, actually, it is in the ICH GCP, and thereby, because this really provides the backbone for all of the clinical trials globally, although we have European guidelines, we have the FDA guidelines, but it has now brought into the part of the ICA-GCP as well. And it goes further that the sponsor is ultimately responsible for the clinical trial data, even when the trial activities are fully outsourced to third parties. So your data is your ownership. And also, furthermore, the sponsor has the ultimate responsibility to ensure that the submission dossier meets regulatory requirements. And then in the section of the ICA GCP 5.2, a sponsor may transfer any or even all sponsor trial related duties and functions to a CRO. That could even be a multiple CROs when we talk about cluster approach. But the responsibility for the quality and the integrity of the trial data always lies with the sponsor. Okay, so let's look at then the FDA. So the FDA has already realized this since 2013 in their guidelines for the risk-based approach monitoring, which is a highly interesting, fascinating concept that I'm sure that all of you are now aware that what is the difference between the risk-based approach monitoring and so-called 100% STV approach in monitoring your clinical data. So FDA, they really refer to sponsor oversight as one of the most important aspects of the study conduct. So this is our FDA's view on this. And then they advise that therefore the practice of co-monitoring and third-party vendors is relatively well established in global pharmaceutical and biotechnology companies. And so I have noticed when I have been working with a variety of companies, and particularly in my consultancy role, that whether they have been a fledgling embryonic startup companies from the academia, mid-sized companies, or large pharmaceutical companies, that there is a bit of variety, that most companies now, they do co-monitoring. They may not have a very clearly established systems, whereas some other companies, they have guidelines, they have their co-monitoring reports, they have systems, tools, and even SOPs. So I'm very, very pleased to see and that the co-monitoring has been recognized by the pharmaceutical companies and the CRO that it is reality and is something that we really, really have to do. Okay, so moving forward. So when when you are issuing and writing your contracts between the sponsor and the CRO contract, it is advisable that your contract should always have a clause to allow for an agreed percentage of the ratio of the monitoring visits to be accompanied by the sponsor. It can, of course, be then further elucidated and specified by some verbal agreements, etc., and so on, and by your more trial-specific co-monitoring plan. So if you have an SOP, which is your overarching global plan for co-monitoring, it may always be worthwhile to have a more sort of specific, trial-specific or program-specific co-monitoring plans. As you know, every single protocol study is very different. Some of the therapeutic areas may be more challenging, for instance, like oncology trials, or when you're working with the biologicals, with the very, very complex patient population or challenging patient populations. So if you custom made or haute couture your trial specific co-monitoring plan, that will always provide you a very good platform opportunity to have that dialogue directly with the CRO or whoever you have contracted out to do your monitoring. Right, okay. So why we think that co-monitoring is vital for the conduct of the clinical trial? Obviously, you can maintain the oversight of your trial management and the monitoring. the quality of the CRA performance. I'd like to add here also the quality of your site performance, data quality, as it was previously mentioned, that the ownership of the clinical trial data always belongs to the sponsor, GCP compliance. Furthermore, your study drug is going to give you a very good opportunity to see how your study drug is managed, stored, and how it's documented on your drug accountability records. Profoundly important part of your clinical trials is, of course, always safety reporting, patient enrollment, and of course, above all, is the protocol compliance. So you're starting to see, I'm just going to go back to my previous slide. So you're starting to see that when you're preparing for your co-monitoring visit, whoever does the co-monitoring from the sponsor side, it can be your project manager, very typically your trial manager, it can be your medical monitor, for instance, it could be your project leader as well, and so on. That's a co-monitor. You need to be aware of quite a few documents on your study, whether it's going to be obviously your protocol, your safety reporting plan, your patient enrollment plan, pharmacy manual, laboratory manual. So during the training course that we are organizing on 20th of June in Brussels, we are going to go through, or we have one specific session, how to best prepare for the co-monitoring visits. So we're going to go through all the documents that you need to review, you need to be aware of. Forms like the monitoring forms that you need to review, even including that it's always worthwhile reviewing your monitor CRA CV, maybe their training record, that there is a documentation, there is a proof that they have been trained for this particular trial. Okay, so a few hints. Why do you think that a face-to-face visit at your clinical trial site is vital and extremely useful? Obviously, sometimes the site staff, they may be a little bit more open to the sponsor on some aspects of the study, particularly if there may be some criticism about some of the processes, etc., and so on. Their day-to-day contact is with the CRA, and they depend a lot on the CRA training them, and they really appreciate that relationship. But and you may be able to learn about some of the things that your site is not reporting directly to the CRO. You can motivate the CRA and the site staff, obviously. You can learn and potentially resolve site issues on that very visit. Okay, and then during the training course, we are going to be discussing that if the different CROs or different sponsors, do they feel is it crucial to have a co-monitoring plan, or what kind of tools and systems they have used, whether they have an SOP, whether there are other departments of the company, whether they are part of the process, as I would expect they would be, like the QA department, for instance. And also we described that, the elements, what should be described in the co-monitoring plan, and I will also bring a live example to that training course. So who performs co-monitoring? I did touch this briefly. That's usually your core team, but it can be almost anybody who you feel is relevant to do the co-monitoring. You may be able to want to send your safety manager to the site if you have had a peculiarly difficult and challenging SAE or SUSAR reporting. Right. So the focus areas, and this is now a bit of repetition, but always when we do training, we love repetition, because that is really reinforcing the message and the learning targets. So recruitment and study progress, adherence to the protocol, subject safety, but also the ethical and regulatory documents. As a co-monitor, you may be able to have an opportunity to look, and I would really recommend to look at the investigator site file and the pharmacy site file. At one glance, you're able to see how well it's organized, and then more on the deeper look, you're able to see that how all the essential documents have been filed, and whether they have been filed, and whether there is some gaps and pending documents in the investigator side file. Right, CRA oversight. I was running a training course last October for one company in Europe, and this was on the agenda. This was the CRA oversight was one of the probably the areas and topics that actually caused a most dialogue and quite vivid discussion between the group. Right, so if we really look at this ICA-GCP, it does actually define the CRA role, and it says, fundamentally, a monitoring visit is a periodic visit conducted to assess the progress of the clinical trial, so enrollment, recruitment, verify adherence to the protocol, and check the data quality, subject safety, and compliance with ethical and regulatory requirements. So it really is there in the GCP guidelines. So when you are working with CRA on site, you obviously you're expecting that they have a full knowledge of the GCP, they're fully trained on the GCP and on the protocol knowledge. The protocol knowledge is quite interesting because sometimes we have been coming across with very, very experienced passionate CRAs who may still not quite understand the eligibility criteria, the inclusion or exclusion criteria, simply because they don't have the same wealth of knowledge of the compound as you do. So therefore, you need to be acting as their tutor from the compound knowledge. You can't really expect the CRA would have time to read the investigator brochure to the same extent as a project manager or project leader. Technical knowledge, obviously, how to use the ECCRT, how to view the queries, how to close the queries. Therapeutic area knowledge to some extent, obviously, that is sufficient, adequate to perform their duties for that particular clinical trial adequately. Monitoring report review, I would always advise the co-monitor to look at the most recent co-monitoring report reviews and whether there are some action items that needs to be closed, and whether you as a co-monitor would be able to assist and help them in closing them. And you also want to look at the methodology of doing the SDV review and the query status, and whether, for instance, particularly if there's quite a big backlog of the queries, how that can be resolved. Okay, so at site, this is going to be providing you a really, really good opportunity when you go on site to see their performance as well. So you may be looking for the trial team availability on your visit, whether the principal investigator is there, sub-investigators, are they available, meet and greet, the protocol knowledge. The training course, we are going to be talking about some rather interesting examples of the investigators or study nurses when they have lacked almost complete knowledge of the protocol and how to resolve that. Also, the study site has been open for 2 years, and by that time you would expect that they at least know the title of your study. About their enrollment, whether they may be having competing trials, access to the source data, how well they're organized, how well they're available. Are source data, are they missing? They can be, and they have been missing when the CRA have organized the monitoring visit. How can you resolve that? Obviously, a major problem, but that can happen. And then obviously the web access and do they have any technical issues? And also you will get a feeling of the investigatable team about the commitment to your study and the interest to your compound and the science. Okay, now I'm going to present a few monitoring practice scenarios. Right, the question is, the scenario is, can a monitor review photocopies of medical records, also called as shadow charts, instead of originals? So which one do you think that inspector will review during the site inspection? So as a general rule, CRAs should only review the original medical reports. If they ask photocopies, the assumption is that it may have been made for the convenience for the CRA. The CRA may not be able to navigate through the records. They not be able to find the pertinent data in the records. And let's face it, sometimes medical records, they can be very, very thick and quite extensive records. So the fundamental problem with the photocopies really is that the CRA cannot be certain the documentation is complete. There may be some pages missing. The data may have been deleted. And inspectors, they always, of course, review against original records. So this may be something that may not happen very often, but it was quite interesting example that we discussed during the training course. How about the monitoring visit log? Do you know whether GCP regulations require that a site establish and maintain a monitoring visit log? So what happens if the CRO forgets to sign it? This can happen. Sometimes it can. I have seen it happen, and there is a proposal. So neither FDA, EU directive, or ICGCP guideline identify the need for the CRA visit log. So that's the background, and that's the regulatory framework. However, keep in mind, it is worth noting that agencies advise their inspectors to check if this log is filed in the ICF. But why is it? Because it provides indication for visit frequency. And as a co-monitorer, you're able to see the intensity of the monitoring activity and whether the monitoring has sometimes been coinciding along with the enrollment. And also this provides a checklist that you can compare this against the monitoring visit reports. Okay, now, so during the last training course last year, the team and the attendees, they particularly asked me to provide examples and signals and signs that may raise a concern on the CRA performance. As sometimes things don't go as planned, and sometimes before things go really quite topsy-turvy, there are certain signs that you may be able to recognize that the CRA may not be quite engaged or involved in the trial. For instance, consistent lack of understanding the protocol or the study requirements, despite training or repeated training. Consistent poor performance. This may be a little bit more difficult for the co-monitor and for the sponsor representative to recognize. But lack of communication. So really being relatively elusive, so not responding to the emails or the phone calls, voice messages, late visit reports without any particular reasons provided, or particular sort of delayed responses to email queries. They may have a compromised relationship with the site, so the site sometimes may give a hint about this, so site feedback. And also sometimes they may not be facilitating sponsor co-monitoring visit. They may not confirm that the monitoring visit has been scheduled for a particular date, or it may be quite late notice. Okay, I would like to mention here that overall, most of the co-monitoring experiences and interactions with the CRAs and CROs are always, and have been in most cases, have been nothing but positive. Okay, right. So our next co-monitoring training course is going to be arranged on 20th of June this year in Brussels. And so we're going to be going more in depth about the regulatory framework, the preparation for the co-monitoring visit, the methodology, the systems, the tools, examples of the SOPs, guidelines, co-monitoring visit report, um, as well as the site and the CRA performance. And I would highly recommend it. The background why ECCRT introduced the co-monitoring training course was that about 18 months ago, we were thinking that there seems to be a need for a co-monitoring training course. A lot of the companies, whether it's the sponsor companies, the pharmaceutical company, biotechnology, or as well as CROs, they run their own internal training courses. But I personally have got a lot of feedback that there was hardly any co-monitoring training course available otherwise. And so that was one of the fundamental reasons that we wanted to introduce a co-monitoring training course. Right. I hope you have enjoyed the webinar today. And I hope that this is also giving you a lot of material and substance for and ideas conducting and continuing with your co-monitoring practice. And now I'm going to be giving this over back to Paula. And Paula, do we have any questions?
Yes, thank you very much for that really interesting talk on co-monitoring, Elena. Yes, we do have some questions. The first one is, could you highlight a section in the regulations that indicate or imply that co-monitoring is necessary for this oversight?
Yes, okay, so I'm going to go back to slide 5, which is fairly right, and there it is. So it has now added into the ICO-GCP E6, and it's in the section 5.5 in the addendum, where it does highlight and emphasize the sponsor should ensure oversight of any trial-related duties. And it also refers to the subcontracted. And furthermore, the FDA has been a little bit more advanced in their attitude and their view of the sponsor oversight. And so they established their risk-based approach to monitoring guidelines in August 2013. So both of these are complementary. So the European guidelines, they recognize this, but not quite as strongly as FDA and ICO-GCP. Okay, anything else?
Yes, actually, related to this co-monitoring oversight, can you outsource all of the co-monitoring? For example, if you're using a CRO to perform the monitoring, can you also outsource the same CRO to perform the co-monitoring on the monitoring they do? Or does this need to be retained by the sponsor?
Right, really interesting question. Yes, a very important question as well. Usually the same organization that is doing monitoring should not be involved in the co-monitoring. It can be a third party, but usually that third party is selected by the sponsor company. So a sponsor company, they can certainly outsource the co-monitoring practice, usually for another company, consultancy company, for instance, or for an independent clinical operations consultant. They can do, and that's something what I have been seeing. But however, if they do this, they still should work very closely with the third party, and then sponsors should have a proof that how they conduct it, and at least that they have reviewed these co-monitoring reports. So when I talk about the regulatory framework, so the regulatory authorities, they expect the sponsor to record it and demonstrate. Demonstrate is probably the best word, that how they have actually conducted the co-monitoring, and they do co-monitoring. So if you do co-monitoring, the important thing is to record it in some way. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of pharmaceutical companies buy biopharmaceuticals. So they started establishing their own SOPs and guidelines and sort of the entire toolbox how to do that. But this is a little bit like the same principle than can co-monitor to do SDV. And this is something that we will again have completely separate session on this during the training course. And the co-monitor cannot do monitoring. You never can do that because then you would be biased to your data, obviously. You can check that the monitoring has been done, or for instance, if monitor has done the SDV, so you can check that or spot check that the SDV has been done correctly. But you have to be extremely careful not to do the monitoring yourself. It is a monitor responsibility, and it has been also made very, very clear in the contract as well. And it's also the GCP principle. Okay. But very interesting.
Actually,
Yeah. Thank you,
sorry,
Paul.
we have a couple more questions. I ask them really quickly. In case that the sponsor has shown that there is kind of a lack of sponsor oversight since the study starts, this actually only comes to awareness at the end of the trial. Is it then too late to perform some of these spot checks at the end of the trial?
I don't think so. I don't think so. I mean, obviously, it is advisable to do the co-monitoring sort of from the as ongoing process. But as long as your data has not been closed, your database is still alive, you can still do those. Oh, definitely.
Okay, great. And then also, last question is, do you recommend a specific frequency to perform co-monitoring?
I would, yes. It very much depends on your protocol and the challenges and the type and the nature of your protocol and your study. I would usually recommend to do the first co-monitoring visits when let's say, your first 10 patients have been enrolled in the study or in the study site. And thereafter, depending on the protocol, it could be every 2 monthly, every 3 monthly. But if you have a guideline or even SOP, do tailor make it according to the challenges of the trial, and obviously, of course, your availability of your staff as well.
Great. And our very last question, I find this one particularly interesting because I am doing some training on risk-based monitoring myself. But this question is it acceptable to perform co-monitoring using a risk-based approach? And then how would you document this?
Right, yes. It is, as long as your study is being monitored based on the principle of the risk-based monitoring. It is.
Great. And so
That's
therefore
that's
that would be
my that's my
documented. Yeah.
that's my interpretation. But some companies I know that because this risk-based monitoring is very clearly defined, that what elements of the data will be monitored and when and to what frequency. Some of the sponsors actually during their co-monitoring risk, they may go beyond this, but that gives you the backbone so you can. So I'm kind of throwing this back to your part, that what would be your view on this?
Yeah, I like this question very much. And I think that, as you mentioned, it works if you're using a whole risk-based monitoring approach totally. I wouldn't necessarily say I'm doing a traditional monitoring approach for this trial, but I'm using a risk-based approach for co-monitoring. What you do is you think all the way up front and say, hey, how am I going to monitor this trial? Using a risk-based approach for the pure monitoring, then I'm also using a risk-based approach for co-monitoring. This should be documented in the monitoring plan, and if you have any specific co-monitoring, the same thing. Very often the co-monitoring assesses almost from a risk-based approach which sites or CRAs to co-monitor, and so that should be documented as well.
Precisely, yes.
Great. So if you want more information either on co-monitoring or on the risk-based management, please go to the ECCRT website and sign up for the different courses. Elena, I think this was a really wonderful presentation. I really appreciate that, and thank you so much. And thank you, everybody else. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.